Welcome to Meet in the Middle with Sam Collins and Norman Pappous. Today we have with us Mr. Reginald Moore from Sugar Land, Texas. The subject today is regarding an unsweet story about Sugar Land. Recently, in the national and international news, there's talk about the bodies that were found at the Fort Bend ISD site, 95 bodies of former prisoners from a prison farm, and Mr. Moore has been the individual behind telling this story long before it hit the Washington Post, New York Times, or CNN. So today he's here in Galveston with us to discuss this story. We want to welcome you to the Rosenberg Library in Galveston.
Thank you. It's an honor and a privilege to be here with you guys.
Thank you for coming, Mr. Moore.
I'm going to take the lead on this. I was invited to a program in April that Mr. Moore hosted in commemoration of not the assassination of Dr. King, but just in memory of his life. It was April 4th, 2018, and that's when I first met Mr. Moore, and he shared with me what was going on in Sugar Land. After that, I went out to a program in May. What was that? Memorial Day.
Memorial Day.
At the old Imperial Farm Cemetery. He had a program, and I was getting caught up to speed on the story there in Sugar Land. But Mr. Moore, before we get started, we want to get a little background about yourself, how you got started in this project, where you're from, where you grew up, so that the audience could get to know you. I know you are proud Jack Yates Lion, right?
That's correct. I'm right out of Third Ward, Texas. I'm a native Houstonian, born and raised, born in Herman Hospital. I had the undubious privilege of having to work at the Texas Department of Criminal Justice System after I had been working as a longshoreman. It started in 1978. And during the recession period came around in the mid-'80s called Reaganomics. The economy got bad, so I had to go to work for the prison system. It was like everybody around me was going to the prison, so I decided if I don't want to get caught up in those numbers, instead of going in white, I'll go in gray. So I went in as a correctional officer and had the privilege of working, not knowing the early history on, but what I was assigned to was the Just One unit, which was formerly named the Harlem Plantation.
The what plantation?
Harlem Plantation.
Harlem Plantation.
Harlem Plantation is on Harlem Road, and the prison, the original name was called the Harlem Prison. Then it changed the name to the Just One unit, which was the first unit that was built by the Texas Department of Criminal Justice after they did not renew Cunningham and Ellis contract, who were the guys who owned this property where 95 graves are found before they sold it to the Kempner family. Then the Kempner family sold it back to the state. So that's where my story begins, and I just want to kind of tell the story of my work there from the Just One to the Just Three unit. And how I seen the
so let me ask you, the people that you heard the story from, what was their point of view? Where did they get their information?
Well, I didn't get the story from anyone else. That's the curiosity of it. We did my own background on this in the mid-'80s. I mean, around 1999, 2000. I wanted to write a book on the crack and sentences disparity that they had. What I saw in the 80s. When we only had 30-some prisons, now we're up to 100, and I saw the blacks coming in there for sentences that should have been maybe misdemeanors, and I saw the whites coming in there for harsher sentences, doing less time. And then they had the same episode that happened in the 90s where they had the crack epidemic, and he had the sentences disparity. So I was going to write a book on then and now, cause and effect, and how the prison industrial complex exploded, from 30-some units to over 100. And we had to force them back in 1985, and it was only in law until late 1982 and passed by 1983, where they had to call it rules of stale, and they had to force the prison system to hire minority officers, and it was predominantly white, and it was pretty much the system that was ran similar to the convict lease system all the way up until that period of time of that reform that came about from Ruiz Estelle through William Wayne Justice.
So when you went and did your research, where did you start? And what got you on the path to the story that has been covered by all the national publications?
Well, when I said I was going to get ready to write the book, it was a cover. I was going to use a house that I knew about. It was on the Texas Department of Criminal Justice property, which was a little short distance from the Justice Unit, which was on the Central Unit. And it was an old colonial-looking house there, and I thought maybe the colonial house was an old plantation house because it had that same type of image, it was built on that same style. So I went up to Austin, to the Texas Law Library up there, the State of Texas Bullock Library, and Texas Historical Commission, and to research this house so that I put it on the cover story of this book that I was writing. That's when I found out that the state was in the planning stages, the Texas Department of Criminal Justice, of selling these properties. Then that's when I found out that that house was the warden's house, and from that story, it led me to the earlier research to find out that they had leased convicts there, that it was a plantation. There was a part of the old Austin 300s. I actually touched the original Austin 300s, Austin's papers and documents before they started microfilming. I was able to touch them. Then when
So
I
just want to get this straight. The warden's house was the old manor house of the plantation?
Well, at the plantation, the system kind of ended around, the convict lease system really ended around 1808 and 1912. And ironic how this happened is that when Cunningham and Ellis had this farm, then they sold it to the Kempner family. And then the Kempner family around 1912 just sold it back to the state. And that's when the state took it over. That's when they built this house called the Flanagan House, which that house was built around 1912. And that was the warden's house that was over the central prison.
So it wasn't an original plantation home, it was built after.
Right. It was built, it wasn't an original plantation home, but on that particular site, which I believe, from my research, it was the old plantation houses were there prior to that because of the conduciveness of that land and that soil. So it was a previous house there on that site prior to this Flanagan House being built in 1912.
But the Flanagan House was the one you was planning on using?
Yes, that was the one I was using for my book and still plan to use for the book and in an opening documentary.
I think also, I've heard you speak several times, and just your point of view when you first got hired and walked out there, the vision of all the men in the field and the officers gave you a feeling that you were still back in the 1800s, and this was mid-1980s.
Right, and sort of like a Gone and Win, what they had back in that old plantation, type of feel. Because when I first started there, we had no black building majors or captains in the whole Texas Department of Criminal Justice System. And all the guys who worked outside on the horsebacks who were overseeing the guys who were in the field were all white. And so it just gave me reflecting back when we were in the stage where in the antebellum period, when the old overseers would look over the slaves and treated them the same way. So I saw no difference with these guys out there chopping cotton and weed and hoeing and during that period of time, CDC was totally self-sufficient, so they did a lot of agriculture work, and just felt like, because
when you say CDC, that is the correctional
Texas Department of Corrections.
Right.
It is not called the Texas Department of Criminal Justice; it's called TDCJ now. During that period, it was just called Texas Department of Corrections. And so that just reminded me, and the fact that I was working on the first prison farm that was built by the state of Texas, which was the Just 1 unit. And that was the first building. And so it was so old and antiquated, along with seeing these guys out on horseback and being all white, and the majority of the guys in the field basically was majority black. So it just kind of took me back to a period that was still existing. It should have been over, but still existing. Oh, so it's like deja vu feeling.
And at that time, in that Sugarland area, with regards to development, do you recall, just in general population? I know now when you drive through Sugarland, there's a lot of development, but at that time, was all of that area along 90, 59, was it built up yet, or
No.
that was still all open fields?
That was actually, all that land was still owned by the Texas Department of Criminal Justice, because all of that originally was part of that old Cunningham Ellis era field land. Then Imperial got a portion of it, then the state all part of Imperial lot, and then other portions that Cunningham and Ellis own. They own over 50,000 acres of land. Okay, so it ran all the way to the Brazos River, basically. From the Brazos River all the way up to around Highway 6 and a little further up, and all the way up to, I say, around Bissonnet area, and all the way up to on the other side of 59. So it encompasses about 50,000 acres of land. And so, it was a real large area. But again, at that time, new territory wasn't there. None of that development was out there. I witnessed new territory being built. And all those homes started coming out there, and they just started selling an awful lot of those tracts of land. And when they started selling those tracts of land, even in the mid-'80s, I was kind of, wondering, who was benefiting from this. And then when I started doing my research in '99 and '01 and '03, when the state sold this land, the big tract that were the 95 grades at now to new development, I just want to make sure that maybe these guys should get some type of restitution, from all of this. But when the question he asked, none of the development was out there now. Mm-hmm. And basically, as the Collins has stated, you have development all around it. And when I showed him out there last time, you look at the Chester 2 unit and less than a half a mile, about a quarter of a mile, you got development right next to it. So none of that development was there. It was all owned by the Texas Department of Criminal Justice, and they used that as field land to work the convicts and grow crops.
And to start getting in on your research, you found documents that really trace the program, the payments, who signed these contracts for all this forced prison labor. And how did you know? How did you know there were graves on this land? What led you to that conclusion? Was there markers out there?
Well, there really wasn't any markers out there. It wasn't any markers. We haven't found any markers today. Okay, and my curiosity back in '03 was everything that transpired on this tract of land, and this land hadn't been touched prior to the antebellum period and prior to the state selling, and then part of Texas part of Sugarland and Newland development on it. It had never been touched prior to that. When they went out there and started doing some archaeological studies and doing conservation, doing the phase 1 reports, and initially they were supposedly to do a 106 review that was supposed to be done by the Galveston Army Corps of Engineers on a permit because it had a water tributary running through it. Mm-hmm. And it had a 106 and a 33 CFR review that put historical preservation, and then the other permit was from the Army Corps. And what they said that they were supposedly to be able to go and do archaeological studies on this, and it's supposed to have been soil, dirt turnovers, archaeological studies, preservation studies. That got circumvented. None of those studies were done. They just took General Land Office and the Historic Commission took a report from a guy named Bob Skiles, who was with the General Land Office, that did an oral report of the area, and so it was never a study that was done properly, and that was something that I tried to enforce, and I brought it to the Historic Commission's attention, and they tried to ratify it after the mistake had been found.
Let me ask you flat out: do you think that the Army Corps of Engineers was nudged away from this because of what they might find?
Well, the Army Corps of Engineers initially had a permit. They had to get a permit from the Corps of Engineers along with a permit from Historical Society. But the Army Corps of Engineers permit initially it wasn't completed because the Army Corps said you need to do shovel testing, you need to turn ground over, you need to do some research because it has a high value, it has a high probability because of the nature of what we know going on, that it may be something there. And so the Army Corps, some kind of way, after the Historic Commission signed off, the Army Corps of Engineers let that permit, approved the permit without their suggestions being met that it should be shovel testing and do archaeological
But do you think the
studies.
motivation for pushing off the Army Corps had something to do with people didn't want this found?
Exactly, no doubt. And I believe it was between the Army Corps of Engineers, Texas Historic Commission, General Land Office. I believe they were all, pretty much with the development, because during that period of time, the law was if you found a grave site, an individual grave or several, you had to make it a cemetery. That law didn't change to 13 and 17, which allowed this entity that we're with now, Fort Bend Independent School District, to extract the bodies, exhume them, and put them somewhere else. Prior to that, during that period of time, they would have had to find one body or several bodies. They had to make it a grave, so they didn't. That would have messed with the overall billions of dollars of development they had if they would have, went and found what we know that's out there today, which would have been found, I believe, during that period there, and it's possibly graves all out throughout that 2,000 some acres they have, and the acreage that was sold prior to '03. That's out there too, part of that 50-some thousand acres they had. Probably scattered sites out there now of graves and camps that we feel like there's out there.
Well, in that area, do you know how many prison camps they had? I know you talked about the Harlem unit, but just in that general, I know we may not be able to name all of them, but some of them that were in that Sugar Land area as far as prison forms. Because the one thing that I think people need to realize is that if these people lived during that time, some of them died during that time. So they had to be buried somewhere. And of course the old Imperial, which I have a picture, Foam Cemetery, had some markers. But in these other areas, these grave sites were not marked. I've heard stories that sometimes they buried men where they fell.
Exactly.
So if a man fell out working in the field, instead of going all the way back to the unit or something, they just dug a hole and buried them out there. So you could have scattered grave sites all over that cemetery.
Well, I'm really curious to know if we know there were graves there. You know what was happening there. Did you know there were graves there, or did you find a lot of evidence that led you to the logical conclusion that there were graves there?
I found a lot of evidence that led me to the logical conclusion. But I knew there were graves out there because they had to be buried somewhere, and they knew when he died, and they were dying by, by the tens and hundreds, okay, within a year's time, over a long period of time, and the fact that
were they getting death certificates? Were these prisoners receiving death certificates?
None that I know of. Okay, not during the convict lease period. Now, when the state of Texas started taking it over around 1886, then there's some records started being kept up. But during the convict lease period and the period of slavery, and then slavery by a new name, what I call it, that transpired in 1867, and it started on this track in 1873, state 75, and then it went to about 1883. But that way, there weren't any records. These guys leased out the whole penal system, and so they actually own the penal system in a sense by the state leasing out the whole system to them, including the Walls unit. And so there wasn't any other prisons out there.
The what unit?
The Walls unit, which is the main building, the main unit up there in Huntsville now.
Okay.
Where they do the executions. All that was the only building that they had was administration building, which it still is today, along with housing a few and doing the what they call the death houses at. But they didn't keep any records. They didn't keep any records that we know of. But it was only one little record that we found. We have found and we're working on now that this guy Ellis, he had a camp out there, which is where the 95 bodies is at, called the Ellis camp. That's one of his camps. And we know that there are 4 other camps that was around this area. Okay, University of Houston is sitting on one. It's another one over there off Brook Street.
This might be a good place to start the next segment.
Yeah. I think this is a great time to take a break. We are going to come back with Mr. Reginald Moore talking about the convict leasing system in Sugar Land, Texas, and the 95 bodies that were found. I think I want to disagree that there are records that are donated and they're in places. We just haven't found all of them, just like the one that you were talking about. But we'll talk about that more when we come back. This is Sam Collins and Norman Pappous with Mr. Reginald Moore on Meet in the Middle.